Chapter 8. These men are driving us hard, too hard. My legs ache, and the fool inside me is frightened because I am. Where are they taking us? Do they know we need rest and a quiet place when we are so close to falling? 4 nights later, I was sitting beside our dying cook fire, wishing the sun would hurry and go down so I could lose my sorrows in sleep, when I heard hoofbeats. I went rigid for an instant, glancing at my mother. We crept outside, ready to run, but this time there was no need. This time it was my father, galloping his big bay, gelding up the hill. He was sitting straight and shouting, and I rejoiced, thinking that my mother's famous knowing had been wrong for once. His men rode with him, all of them shouting and whooping as they came up the hill. The hounds ran silent, their tongues hanging out. The men dropped back a little as they got closer, letting my father lead the way. Then all reined in, pulling their sweating horses to a halt in front of our house. My father dismounted slowly, and only then did I realize he was using one arm. My mother had been right, as always, but my heart was still unburdened to see him smiling, looking strong in spite of the bloody wound across his left forearm. I saw a crease in his shield and wondered what almighty blow had done it, the one that had wounded him. I shivered and looked back at my mother. I could see in her eyes that she was overwhelmed with happiness to see him alive and acting like himself. I knew, too, that she was glad to have him home where she could tend to him. I was not so sure about what I felt as always. When my father was home, everything changed. I stood back a little watching. The men laughed as my tall, broad father swung my little bird-bone mother around in a circle with his one good arm around her waist and her arms around his neck. They shouted, jested, and spun their horses around, acting like boys. It was always like this when my father came home, at first anyways. The hounds barked, then slunk off in the dark to find water and their familiar sleep dens behind their houses. The men quieted when they saw the look on my mother's face when my father set her down and she stepped back. "Please listen," she said quietly. They were silent as she described the raid, told them all that all the mares but one had been taken, and Bevan. She told the story of how we had found Magnus and told them all the old man was doing all right. She left nothing out and no one interrupted her. "I'm off to see my own wife then," a voice came. "I'm off to see my own wife then," a voice came out of the near dark. The moment my mother stopped speaking, I recognized it, Bevan's father. "Take my horse," my father said, passing the reins to Magnus's eldest brother. "Close them all in the raft and carry your saddle pads and bridles home. Sleep with your ears open," he added, then turned to embrace my mother with one arm again. The men cantered off, and I heard their voices in the dark as they settled their tired horses for the night. I heard them calling farewells to one another as they headed toward their homes and families. Moments later I heard laughter and children's shouts spread from one house to the next. The glow of rekindled fires lightened the open doorways. "Laura?" "Yes, father," I answered respectfully, jolted out of my dreamy eavesdropping. "Come in out of the damp." "Yes, father," I answered him, and turned for the door. He had built up the fire, and my mother had wrapped his forearm in a piece of clean linen. It had been torn from a length of her finest soft cloth, dyed the beautiful blue only royalty were allowed to wear. My father looked content. My mother was boiling a handful of barley. It smelled wonderful, and my mouth watered. "I hope you girls are nearly ready to take the cattle in to the upland pastures," my father said, looking at me. "We will need the milk and cheese sorely this year, your mother tells me." His chin lifted and he narrowed his eyes. "You've grown." I nodded. "I am taller than mother now." "Only a little," she said, pretending offense to make him laugh. He didn't notice. He nodded absently, already thinking past such a small thing as my height. "The fields are manured," I said, and was rewarded with an approving nod. "We cleaned chicken byres and the raft," I added. I recited all the chores I could think of, watching his face brighten a little with each one. He looked at my mother and nodded. I knew that was all the thanks either of us would get for all the weary days of hard work since we had last seen him. "In the morning," he said, "plowing can begin." He looked at my mother. "How many days until Beltane?" She glanced up, counting. 8. He nodded. "The morning after Beltane we'll get the cows away and up onto the high pastures and good grass. Before that we will plow and plant and gather wood and all else that we need to do. Once we are settled for the summer, once the crops are in the ground, I'll ride after the raiders." I swallowed hard. I understood. I did. I knew the men had to stay to plow and plant. We were all hungry, and we had months to go before harvest. Delaying it could easily mean starvation for some of us, but I still wanted them to ride after Bevan now, this very night. I saw my father glance at my mother, and an uneasy look crossed his face. I looked at her and realized he hadn't seen her for months. She had been so thin, and she looked very tired. "Tell us a tale," she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight. My father began to talk. He told us of a buck as tall as a horse that he had seen in the forest, of a storm that had blown an oak down, of the stone-walled castle in Athenry, and the stone wall that had been built around the town. Then, as the fire wore itself out, and the embers glowed in the dark house, he spoke of battles he had fought, that there was a new alliance with what was left of O'Flaherty clan near Galway, wherever that was. They had driven the Normans back from Old Tomb, he said. My mother nodded and made sounds of interest, but I saw her staring out at the open door into the night. I wondered if her thoughts were the same as mine. What good was winning battles if Bevan had been carried off? Would winning battles feed us? If it never had. If he had stayed home to protect us, the planting would be done, we would still have our horses, and dear Bevan would be in her own home this night. I sat close to the dying fire and thought about going up to the high pasture with the others. This would be my first year to help. I had been scared and excited about it before, when Bevan and Garrick and I were to have gone together. It would have been the first time for all three of us. Now the idea of leaving our wrath and the houses of our two scared me. What if the raiders came to the upland pastures? What if all the stock was stolen? How would we live? I had heard about raids all of my life in stories. Somehow I had never understood that the stories were real. I lay down with my cold, dark thoughts and listened to my parents whispering long into the night. I could only hear parts of what they said clearly enough to understand, and some of that made no sense to me anyway. After asking him 3 times, each time in a different way, my mother finally got an answer about whether or not the battles had been won or lost. Both, my father said. He sounded weary now. I could imagine the sparkle going out of his eyes. The Normans in Galway town are there to stay, I fear, and in Anthree. But the O'Flahertys will keep them worried and push the O'Connors back into their place at least. My mother was silent, and I knew she was hoping he would say more. Ireland has only once had her own king, my father said bitterly. We've had Norse invaders from the sea and men from the Saints only nowhere else. And these Normans let in by Strongbow, the fool building their keeps and castles and abbeys. And the only one who united us all against them was Brian Boru. My father turned and spat into the fire pit. The sudden hissing startled me, and my heart leaped. His reign was all too short, my father said, and in a voice so low I could barely hear him, and all too long ago. He pulled in a long breath, and Irishmen raid each other's horses and cattle instead of fighting Normans. His voice was heavy with fatigue and discouragement. I wondered if they all sounded like him tonight, talking to their wives. I knew Garrick would lie awake listening, that Magnus would, too, and I wondered where Bevan was, and I had to turn over to hide my crying.